Now I have extreme pleasure and an honor to welcome, to say a few words, the Premier of Alberta, Honorable Jason Keney.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dzień dobry. Niech będzie pochwalony Jezus Chrystus. Thank you so much to my colleague Mickey Amory, Your Worship, the Mayor, to Councillor Chabot, Reverend Father, and all of you from Polonia for joining with us here at the heart of Alberta's government in southern Alberta, McDougall Centre, this historic place, to raise the flag of the free, independent, sovereign, and proud Polish nation as we begin to celebrate Polish Heritage Month in Alberta. I want to thank and acknowledge in absentia my legislature colleague Dan Williams, MLA for Peace River, for his visionary leadership in bringing forward the bill that created Polish Heritage Month in Alberta, Bill 217, that was passed in the legislature last year, which recognized for the first time in Alberta law officially the enormous role that Polonia has played in building Alberta to become the envy of the world, one of the most prosperous and dynamic societies anywhere on the face of the earth, thanks in part to waves of newcomers, including hardworking pioneers and immigrants from Eastern Europe in the turn of the last century, so many of whom came from Poland. Now, the truth is this. Thank you so much, Tony, for that great historical rundown. But the reality is that when most Albertans think about the settlement of the Canadian prairies in Alberta, they think of the Ukrainians, and understandably so, because they came in such large numbers and have created such a huge impact in this province. But of course, so many of them came from Western Ukraine in areas that at various times had been under Polish sovereignty, and many were confused. Many Poles have been confused as people of Ukrainian origin. I mean, for example, the Ukrainians claim that Wayne Gretzky is Ukrainian, but in fact his ancestors came from what is now the Polish side of the border. Don Mazinkowski, the former deputy prime minister, is sometimes misattributed as being a Alberta Ukrainian when of course he was a proud son of Polish immigrants. So yours is a community that has made an outsized contribution in this province for well over a century and continues to do so. But your community has brought some special, unique gifts to this province, and one is a deep and abiding love for freedom. As sons and daughters of Poland, a country that for so much of its history has lived under occupation and which for several decades of the last century lived behind the Iron Curtain. As a nation that was divided at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that was the first victim of that evil accord between the twin totalitarian forces of communism and Nazi fascism. With that lived experience, yours is a community that never takes freedom for granted, that understands that freedom is something we must always defend, as the Polish people are so proudly doing for their neighbors, their cousins in Ukraine today. The flagpole that we are using for this flag-raising ceremony today normally has the Ukrainian flag raised here as a symbol of Alberta's solidarity with Ukraine. I want to thank Polonia here in Calgary, in Alberta, but Polonia globally, especially the Polish government, for being the most forceful in opposing Vladimir Putin's outrageous attack of Ukraine, not just with words and sentiments, not just with humanitarian support and welcoming millions of displaced Ukrainians, but yes, with enormous quantities of heavy, lethal military equipment that is helping Ukraine to defend itself from this outrageous invasion. So thank you, through Polonia, to the Polish government and the Polish people. And I know one of my achievements as Minister of National Defense was to deploy the Canadian Armed Forces to Ukraine in Operation Unifier to help train them to modernize their military in ways that the effectiveness of which we now see on the battlefields in Donbass. But I also deployed the Canadian Armed Forces to Poland in 2014 and 15 as a sign of NATO solidarity with our Eastern European NATO allies following the Russian invasion of both Crimea and Donbass at that time. I was very proud to work closely with Polonia as Minister of Citizenship, Immigration, for 5 years as Minister of Multiculturalism for Canada, for 10 years as well as Minister of National Defense. And indeed, I was very proud to have led the way to the elimination of the Canadian visa requirement for Polish nationals coming to Canada, something that we did in 2008. And so I want to, just in closing, underscore the depth of the connections between Canada and Poland are represented by the flag that we are about to raise. During the Napoleonic Wars, Poland, by the way, all through its history, has been aligned with Canada. You just think about the Polish Free Army fighting alongside, fully integrated into the 1st Canadian Armored Division in the liberation of the Netherlands, and of course, in the liberation of Italy, ultimately the liberation of Western Europe. You can see this if you go to the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising, which I visited in one of my many trips to Poland. You will see the most impressive exhibit there is a recovered and restored Royal Canadian Air Force Halifax bomber that was dangerously flying relief supplies into Warsaw to support the Home Army and the brave women and men of Warsaw who rose up against the Nazis as the Soviets closed in on Warsaw in 1944. And that Canadian crew was shot down about 100 kilometers south of Warsaw. And that airplane, that bomber, ended up being embedded in a peat bog in rural Poland. It was rediscovered by a farmer 15 years ago. They recovered the remains that were repatriated to Canada of the airmen. And that RCAF Halifax bomber now has been reconstructed and proudly stands as a permanent symbol of the partnership in blood between Canadians and Poles in the defense of freedom. This flag that we are about to raise, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Duke of Wellington who was leading the British forces against Napoleon, was so profoundly impressed by his Polish allies. And the Polish hussars carried into battle against Napoleon's forces the red and white standard. And Wellington was so impressed by this that he made those colors the colors of the British Army. When the Royal Military College was established in Kingston, Ontario in the 1840s, they adopted, of course, the colors of the British Army, red and white, in the Royal Military College standard in their flag. And many years later, in the 1960s, a graduate of that school, an MP, Mr. Matheson, used that flag as the basis for the Canadian flag. So there's a direct historical lineage between the historic flag of Poland and the historic flag of Canada. Our red and white colors come from Poland's red and white. So this is a partnership that goes back for so many years. And finally, let me say that Poland has always meant so much to me, in part because of St. John Paul II, who I call St. John Paul the Great, who had a huge impact on my life as a young man. And we are blessed that St. John Paul visited us here in Alberta in 1984. Another expression of the amity between the greatest Pole of modern times, indeed, and the province of Alberta. So thank you so much for being here. God bless you all. Niech żyje Polska.
Thank you very much, Kenny, for heartfelt speech, and you're a great friend of Poland, great friend of Polonia, and we really thank you from the deep of our hearts for all things you've done for our community over the years. Thank you very much, Kenny.